All right, so when it comes to painting an image that hasn't been embossed, you have to be just a little bit more careful when you're coloring in the images. So I'm going to start with the background again. I'm doing the same background as I did for the last one, so it's just a light gray color. And I'm starting in the center and then moving my way out so that it lightens as we go out. And I typically will move my paper as I'm moving around the image. Now you see I've almost gotten rid of all of those leaves there. So when you're doing this, you also have to be careful if you go over a huge section that you don't get rid of all your guidelines. Unless you're good at improvising. But I always find, especially when you're starting watercolor, using a stamped image to practice on is so much more helpful than a blank page and coming up with your own composition. I'm working on the freehand watercolor, but not there yet. Always a work in progress, the new skills. All right, brush has gotten really, really dry, so just squeeze it on the paper towel to get more water out. There we go, and then a tiny little bit in here and in here. There we go. All right, now let's work on the flowers. So these flowers are slightly different from the last ones. I want to say that maybe they're peonies, but I'm not sure. Maybe they're just really fluffy roses. So once again, I start with my light color and then I add my dark color in. And I just started with the little buds because they're tiny. When it comes to the actual flower, because you don't have the embossing separating each of the petals, you need to be just a little bit more careful because colors will run into the next section. These particular watercolor crayons I'm using don't have water in them, obviously, and I can control how much water I'm adding with my brush. But if you happen to be using some more liquid watercolors, you might have a problem with sections running into each other. So the way to prevent them from running into each other would be to say, color this petal and then color one that's not even close to it, and then wait to color the petals around this one until the first one is dry. So it's just a slightly different way of watercoloring, because if you color two wet sections next to each other, especially if you have a medium that's a little bit more liquid, you lose a little bit of the control about where the color is running. It tends to run into the different sections that are still wet. Maybe the look that you're going for, but may not be the look that you're going for. So that particular one had too much of the dark color on my brush still, so what I'm doing to take it off is I'm just using a wet brush to scoop it up and then wipe it onto my paper towel. And really, you could use any floral stamps for these. I like using Stampers Anonymous for these classes simply because they never discontinue their stamps, so I know that if someone takes a class this week or 5 years from now, they'll still be able to get them if they want them. And the images are really pretty. So I tend to put the darker color where the petal goes behind another one, just because that's where the shadow would be. And I'm leaving just a tiny little bit of white in some of those areas just so that you can see that there's a little bit of division between the petals. It's going to look a little bit like a highlight. Not a bright highlight, because flowers don't have, unless they are white, they don't have bright white highlights on them. All right, that flower is done. Let's do this one here. I did that whole section as one simply because there wasn't really any lines dividing it. And you see I move my paper around a lot while I'm painting, and that's simply because I want the darkest color is typically the farthest away from me, so I typically start where I want the dark color darkest. And this has gotten a little bit too dark for me, so I'm just going to pull some of the darker petal tips off. All right, so those are done. I'm going to work on this one here. Now, I did this flower in a yellow color simply because I wanted to differentiate that it's different from the other petal or the other flowers. Yellow is my least favorite color, so I'm trying to do it paler than my sample. And this one here, I colored the entire thing. I can still see the lines, and I'm just going to tap in some of the darker where the petals go behind the other. My lines are definitely fading a lot more with this one than they did with the first one, and that's probably because my ink is fresh. When I did the other one, I had stamped it a while before I painted it, as well as the fact that I had just re-inked the stamp before painting it. So let's do some of the leaves here. Once again, I'm doing the light color first, and then I'm just tapping the dark color at the base where the leaf meets the stem. And if you tap it, you tend to have more color than if you swipe the color on there. There we go. And then the last of the leaves. And then just tap in some of the dark color. And I can see a little section right there. There was a leaf in front of the flower. And then the leaves underneath these little buds here. And I started with light, but I think I'm just gonna make them a bit darker there. There we go. So I'm gonna let that dry completely, and then we will assemble our card.